Every revolution starts in the minds of the people. Arm yourself for the war of ideas. Take back your life. Take back your liberty. Tom Mullen Talks Freedom.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Tom Mullen Talks Freedom. Today is Friday, February 20th, and I'm here today for another update on the Trump administration. Of course, we had some good news in our last episode, along with Eric Peters, on something that, after quite a while, without being able to say this, the Trump administration actually delivered to its supporters and to the American people in general, which was the rescinding of the ridiculous endangerment pronouncement regarding CO2 being a danger to public health and welfare, something that underpins a whole bunch of draconian climate change regulations, imposing emission standards and other mileage standards on automobiles that, without coming right out and saying it, amount to a electric vehicle mandate. So I wish I was here to say that there's more good news, but unfortunately there isn't. That's all we get, hopefully not for another, 8 months or however long it had been since the Trump administration last did something right. But for now, while the rest of the country is still gripped by mass hysteria over at least the third mostly false sex crime scandal, fever dream, whatever you want to call it, in the last 15 years, we're moving ever closer to some kind of military action against Iran. And for a president that ran on either you elect me or you get World War III, this is not good in terms of the supposed peace president. And unfortunately, there's actually a parallel between what's going on with Iran and what happened at the beginning of the very first World War, at least the first one we called a world war. And that has to do with the deal that Trump has proposed to Iran. I mean, we could call the deal the ultimatum, the demands that they've made. Originally, it was the red line that that Iran can't have a nuclear weapon. And there's lots of debate when the last time they were trying to have a nuclear weapon. I think they're crazy for not trying to have a nuclear weapon, just because we can clearly see that when you don't have a nuclear weapon, you are in constant danger of being invaded, mostly by the United States or one of its proxies. So, of course, North Korea has nuclear weapons, and for all the axis of evil talk, nobody's talking about invading them. But it's been almost constant talk during this century about going to war with Iran. I'm not exactly sure what has stopped all these administrations from doing it, other than I'm, told by sources even I consider reliable, like Colonel Douglas Macgregor, that it would be a hard war for the United States to win. I guess I shouldn't say, that's hard to believe, since the United States couldn't win in a war in Afghanistan. I mean, they won all the battles. The soldiers, they had no problem. But as far as winning the war, which is a strategic outcome, Washington, D.C., of course, spent 20 years and billions of dollars, maybe approaching $1 trillion, to replace the Taliban with the Taliban. So, of course, a dismal failure. I don't know if we can claim some kind of success in Iraq. I mean, obviously they overthrew Saddam Hussein, and now it's being run by forces friendly to Iran. So nice work there, Empire. But in any case, they've been talking since the Bush administration about, rattling their sabers at Iran, and a war hasn't happened yet. I hope one does not happen. But this latest ultimatum to Iran has a parallel with the ultimatum issued to Serbia in 1914. A lot of people remember that the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir apparent to the Austro-Hungarian throne, which was a dual monarchy at the time and very complicated, but he was an heir to the throne. And he might have been, now my memory's failing, perhaps could have unified the throne, perhaps not. But he was assassinated, and everyone knows that somehow that led to World War I, and that there were many alliances already in place and a kind of a domino effect. But it wasn't just they shot the Archduke and then the next day everybody was bombing each other. There was a series of events after that, and there was a response by the Austro-Hungarian government to Serbia. And they basically, instead of like Don Corleone, they didn't give them an offer they couldn't refuse. They gave them an offer that they couldn't accept. And very much the Austrian government knew they would be unable to accept. And basically, Austria, the Austrian Empire's position was, look, we know that these troublemakers in Bosnia, which was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So I guess I should also back up for anyone who doesn't know or doesn't remember, if high school history or college history is as long ago as it was for me, that relatively recently Bosnia-Herzegovina, and I don't know, I've only ever read that name. I don't know how it's supposed to be pronounced. So I'm just going to say Bosnia from now on, if that's okay with everybody else. And even if it's not okay. So that had recently been annexed by the Austrian Empire. And I'm calling the Austro-Hungarian Empire the Austrian Empire as well. So it had previously been part of the Ottoman Empire, and there was a treaty in 1909. And part of that was that this region was part of the Austrian Empire, but it had a lot of Serbians in it. This should all sound familiar to anybody over 40, I guess, who remembers the 1990s and the whole kerfluffle there and Clinton bombing Serbia over the same region. So there was a lot of trouble in Bosnia made by a revolutionary group or a separatist group or nationalist group, whatever you want to call it, of Serbians living there who did not like the fact that, the Austrian Empire was given jurisdiction over this area. They wanted it to be part of Serbia. And so when Archduke Franz Ferdinand was visiting Bosnia, that's when they shot him. There was a series of attacks on not just him, but other people. I think they tried to blow up his car and it didn't work. Then they shot him. So it was a coordinated attack. And with this background, the Austrian government accused the Serbian government of condoning this revolutionary group, this national group, terrorist group, whatever you want to call them. It depends on whose side you're on, right? They were patriots if you're on the Serbian side, and they're terrorists if you're on the Austrian side. And again, some things never change, right? So Austria wrote a letter. It actually was delivered by one member it wasn't like the emperor to the king of Serbia, but it was one of the ministers to, I think, the finance minister of Serbia. And they issued a bunch of demands. And the demands, Serbia made some effort to comply with, but they couldn't comply with all of them. I'm debating on whether to read all these to you because it's rather long. There's a long preamble to the note saying, look, your rights were not, you will recognize that your rights were not violated by the Treaty of 1909, the Treaty of Berlin, blah, blah, blah. You agree to all these things. And then they gave them 10 points. And yeah, I will read them. It's not that long. And the overall objection, and this was a poison pill, because the Austria didn't want them to comply. They wanted to justify military action against Serbia to punish them for the attack and the assassination. But they went through the motions of issuing these demands, knowing Serbia would never comply. So here's point number one. And again, I'll post a link to this and you could read the whole thing, because before this list of 10 items, There's a several paragraph preamble, and then there's some notes after this. But number one is to suppress every publication which shall incite to hatred and contempt of the monarchy, and the general tendency of which shall be directed against the territorial integrity of the latter. So basically, they're saying you have to suppress what we would call the free press in saying anything bad about Austria. Okay. So believe it or not, this did not, this was not a point of contention with Serbia as much because they didn't have the traditions we have here of the free press that can say whatever they want. Number two is to proceed at once to the dissolution of the Narodnya Odbrania. Okay, so let's just call that the dissident group, because I don't want to try to pronounce that name again. We won't call them the terrorist group, and we won't call them the patriot group. We'll call them the dissident group. But that Serbia has to dissolve this group, to confiscate all of its means of propaganda, and in the same manner to proceed against the other unions and associations in Serbia which occupy themselves with propaganda against Austria-Hungary. The royal government will take such measures as are necessary to make sure that the dissolved associations may not continue their activities, other names, or in other forms. So again, they're telling them that you have to dissolve this association, this political group, and that even that the Austrian government will take measures necessary to make sure that they really stay dissolved. So again, this was something that we wouldn't stand for, of course. Most countries would not stand for, but not really the point of contention either. Number three, to eliminate without any delay from public instruction in Serbia everything, whether connected with the teaching core or with the methods of teaching that serves or may serve to nourish the propaganda against Austria-Hungary. So you can't teach your kids anything that might make them hate Austria in your schools, okay? Number four, to remove from the military and administrative service in general all officers and all officials who have been guilty of carrying on the propaganda against Austria-Hungary, whose names the imperial and royal government reserves the right to make known to the royal government when communicating the material evidence now in its possession. So they're telling Serbia who they have to fire from their own government and military. And Austria will tell them who it is. We'll give you a list of names and you have to get rid of these people. Number five, to agree to the cooperation in Serbia of the organs of the imperial and royal government in the suppression of the subversive movement directed against the integrity of the monarchy. So this is one of the places where Serbia said, no, we can't do that. It's unconstitutional, where, the Serbian government is actually in there enforcing the treaty itself inside Serbia. Number six, to institute a judicial inquiry against every participant in the conspiracy of the 28th of June, that's when they assassinated the Archduke, who may be found in Serbian territory. The organs of the imperial and royal government delegated for this process will take part in the proceedings held for this purpose. So again, just impossible. You're going to have members of the Austrian government taking part in Serbian judicial proceedings. They can't do it. Now, a lot of people have said Serbia had no intention of complying with any of this, but at least they paid lip service that they wanted to, but they said this is one they couldn't do. I mean, just impossible. And Austria knew it was impossible when they tried to impose it on them. Number seven, to undertake with all haste the arrest of Major Vojislav Tankosic and of one Milan Siganovic, a Serbian official who have been compromised by the results of the inquiry. Number eight, by efficient measures to prevent the participation of Serbian authorities in the smuggling of weapons and explosives across the frontier to dismiss from the service and to punish severely those members of the frontier service of Shabats and Loznitsa who assisted the authors of the crime of Sarajevo to cross the frontier. So, I mean, that's one they could say, yeah, we'll comply with that. We'll make sure no one's running guns into Bosnia, and we'll fire anybody who we catch doing it. That one's pretty reasonable, right? And, Serbia would at least say that they're going to do it, whether they meant it or not. Number 9, to make explanations to the imperial and royal government, that's Austria, concerning the unjustifiable utterances of high Serbian functionaries in Serbia and abroad who, without regard for their official position, have not hesitated to express themselves in a manner hostile towards Austria-Hungary since the assassination of the 28th of June. So they're saying, like, look, since this assassination, you still got people out there kind of like celebrating the death of Charlie Kirk, so to speak, right? So a parallel to that, only maybe officials from the government. And, again, it's somewhat humiliating, but something Serbia could say, yeah, we'll do that. We'll tell these people to pipe down. We're happy to write you a letter telling you all about it. And then number 10, to inform the imperial and royal government without delay of the execution of the measures comprised in the foregoing points. So they're basically making these demands saying, if you don't want us to punish you militarily, you will do these things. And as you can see, I mean, the whole list, other than maybe, what was the number? Number 8, don't run guns into Bosnia, which is our territory. I think that one was pretty reasonable. But the rest of them, I mean, we're telling you who to fire. We're telling you what your teachers can teach in schools. We're telling you, all of it. And Serbia was ready to agree to most of it. But I think it might have been just the point about like Austrian government officials participating in their judicial proceedings. It's just, we can't do that without changing our constitution. So in any case, they didn't comply according to Austria, and Austria started to take military action against Serbia. And before they did that, they actually consulted the Kaiser in Germany. What do you think? And, there's the famous blank check that the Kaiser supposedly gave Austria. But when you look, and here's another place where Pat Buchanan's book with all its primary sources is so helpful in understanding this. Like, Germany wanted to let Austria punish Serbia, but just don't go overboard here because we don't want Russia coming in. Now, Germany's long-standing contention was that they were in this, very vulnerable position because of the alliance between France to Germany's west, on Germany's western border, and Russia on Germany's eastern border. And you should remember, what the map of Europe looked like in 1914. There were far fewer countries. There was no Poland at the time. There was no Czechoslovakia. There was basically Germany and Austria right to its south. And then going east, it was bordered by Russia on a lot of that border. And then you had the smaller countries that had broken away from the Ottoman Empire, Romania, Bulgaria, Serbia, and I always forget the last one, but a few more. But Germany had a huge border with Russia going all the way to the North Sea. No Poland there. All of what is today Poland, or what would be Poland after World War I, was either part of Germany or part of Russia, the Russian Empire. And all of the Baltic states were part of Germany. So you had that long corridor there along the sea, and Germany felt like, or expressed, it kind of echoes like Russia. You can't roll up NATO to our border, and you've kind of tried to encircle us. Well, Germany was saying many of the same things in 1914 with the alliance between France and Russia. And, the fact of England coming in on the side of France was, that was the death knell for Germany in their eyes. And don't forget, all these people were related. So the Kaiser and the King of England were first cousins. And then the Kaiser and the Russian Tsar were also cousins. So it was, just a different, crazy situation in that sense. But you got this, what started it all, and what eventually happened, of course, is that Austria started punishing Serbia too severely. And then the Kaiser said, whoa, it's time to hold up. We don't want Russia coming in. Russia came in, and that triggered the alliance with France and Germany, saying we can't let, France take the initiative with Russia coming into Serbia, then march through Belgium to preemptively strike France. And there's a lot of hit. I really recommend Buchanan's book, Churchill, Hitler, and the Unnecessary War, spends quite a bit of time on the lead up to World War I and a whole bunch of primary sources. And of course, the Kaiser has lots of responsibility in World War I, but his book is much more balanced, showing how it could have been avoided, even World War I, how it wasn't just the Kaiser who was being aggressive here, and that Churchill bore a large part of responsibility. He and a few operatives that were operating in secret with the French without the knowledge of the rest of the liberal cabinet at the time, which would not have condoned any kind of even unofficial promises to France to come into a war if they go to war with Germany. So there was all kinds of intrigue going on. It was really a tragedy, World War I, because the world wars together, I think, destroyed, the old classical liberal world, both in Europe and the United States, especially after World War II in the United States. But it all started with this ultimatum issued to Serbia that they couldn't comply with. Austria purposefully gave them something there was no way they could comply with. And, for the express purpose of creating a casus belli, however that's pronounced. I only read some of these things, so forgive my ignorance. And that's what they wanted to do. They wanted to go into Serbia and punish them for the assassination. So what do we have today? We've got Iran. And, every time you try and say anything sensible about Iran, of course, you're going to get the comments that you're on the side of the terrorists. I guess since they're belligerent with Israel, or more vice versa than going the other way. Well, maybe that's not fair. I mean, Iran does fund Hezbollah, and I think objects officially to the existence of Israel because it was created in an already existing state called Palestine, and that's, of course, disputed. There were certainly people living there. So I don't want to try to sort that out right now, but they are belligerent toward Israel, but not aggressive other than funding dissident groups who, occasionally shoot missiles into Israel. And on the other hand, Israel's very belligerent, and is, especially since in these last few years, has undertaken a more expansive role in the sense of territorially, not only into the Gaza Strip, but into parts of Syria. Okay, they say they're defending themselves. Their critics say, no, you're taking advantage of a situation to do what you've always wanted to do. Again, not trying to sort it out, but from the perspective of the United States, I mean, none of this benefits American citizens one way or the other. And the other thing I want to say about Iran before we get into what the Trump administration is doing to Iran is that I wouldn't want to live there. And, they certainly don't have as free a society as Western countries do, although those are, no saints in the freedom category either. And they're getting worse all the time, not just on speech, but on all kinds of things, especially economic and financial, which to me are more important than free speech, because without economic freedom, you have no control over your life. you could be forced to keep your mouth shut, and you shouldn't be. And it's very dangerous to suppress speech, but you could still pursue your goals. But when they cut off your economic freedom, you can't do that either. So lots of people getting rich in China with no freedom of speech because they have a largely capitalist economy with a lot of state intervention, just like ours. So anyway, but the fact, like when you argue with somebody that the U.S. should not be aggressive toward Iran, I don't consider it a valid argument to say they oppress their own people. Okay. That's a subjective claim. I could claim Washington, D.C. suppresses its own people, and people could say, no, they don't. It's better than other places. And that's probably true. But regardless of whether they suppress their own people, the only business that the United States has in regard to any other country is whether or not they're a threat to their own people. That's it. Okay. So they could be the most oppressive country in the world, and they're certainly, they're not the freest country in the world. We could all agree on that. But as far as showing aggression to other countries outside their borders, they have been relatively, non-aggressive for hundreds of years. And again, recognizing that they may be funding, some of these terrorist groups. They call them patriot groups. We call them terrorist groups, depending on whose side you're on. But they haven't tried to attack any of their neighbors. We funded that proxy war. I hate to say that. Washington funded that proxy war against them in the 80s between Iraq and Iran, and funded both sides. And, we thought that was a lot of fun. But they really haven't, attacked other countries. And even if they attacked other countries, the United States would have to prove, but make a case at least that's somehow a threat to American citizens. And I don't mean American citizens like soldiers on the Iran border. That doesn't, if you put your soldiers over there and in a contested zone, I don't want to see them killed, but you can't then go and say they're a threat to, our soldiers encircling their country. Okay. And Iran, the last time I checked, still has a military budget of something like $15 billion. $15 billion. And their whole GDP is something like, it's under 400 billion. Okay. But they spend about 15 billion on their military. The United States right now spends 1,000 billion or 1 trillion. And Trump, I don't know whether he's going to be able to do it, whether the big, beautiful bill will give him the funding. He wants to spend 1,500 trillion or billion. So in other words, 1.5 trillion. So that would be 100. What's the math? If it's 1,000, it would be 1,000 times what Israel spends. And it's almost there now. So in terms of dollars, of course, they're no threat. There's certainly no threat to Americans in America. Now, they can shut down that Strait of Hormuz, which would disrupt somewhat oil trade. And everyone makes a big deal about that. But please, don't tell me in 2026, with the United States self-sufficient on oil to begin with, that this is going to be some threat to the United States, even if they did it. That would justify a war. Okay. So with that background, we don't have like a letter like the Austrians sent the Serbs in 1914 with bullet points. We got Trump just saying whatever's on the top of his mind, depending on the day. I'm sure the administration has some list somewhere, but we don't have a good list. And I tried to find, well, is there a published outline of what they're offering Iran? And it's no, but at various times they've said the usual things. They have to give up their nuclear program. which Trump claimed, their nuclear weapons program, excuse me, which Trump claims that they obliterated, right? So that was 6 months ago. It's obliterated. Well, what does that mean? Is it gone? Is it rebuildable very quickly? I mean, the Iranians said that bombing mission basically didn't do all that much, which I kind of tend to believe that's the case because it was so far underground, but who knows? But they have to give up their nuclear program. They say they don't have one. So if they're telling the truth, then that's also an offer you can't accept because it's like we already gave it up 20 years ago. And they have some, whatever they call them, I don't know if fatwa is the aggressive thing, but they have got pronouncement by the head mullah over there that nuclear weapons are against Islam and they're not to be produced. So that's their official position. Every time the CIA tries to look into this, they conclude that there is no weapons program, but they've been, 6 months away from having one since the late 1990s. But that's always been on the table. You have to give up your nuclear weapons program. But here's how they've upped the ante. So the previous deal with Iran on nuclear enrichment in general, non-weapons nuclear enrichment, was you can only enrich to 5%, which is the level that allows you to do nuclear energy, like, to produce electricity and those kinds of things. So you're allowed to do that, but you're not allowed to enrich beyond that. Now, I have tried to find an expert to come on and just talk about enrichment to educate us further, and I've tried to read about it myself, but here is what I keep finding. And by the way, if you are a nuclear expert, I know one person who's worked on reactors. He's a physicist, but he says this is kind of outside his general expertise. And I'm not sure he's all that, gung-ho about going on a political show. But if you would like to come on, if you have an expertise in uranium enrichment, then write to me and we'll see if we can get you on. But in any case, here's what I do understand about enrichment is that you need to enrich to 5% to produce nuclear energy. And the previous deal allowed Iran to do that. You need to enrich to 20% to do medical isotopes. And Iran has always been prohibited from doing that. And I really don't understand. Well, I do understand why, but really, first of all, there's no justification for one country telling another that it can't have nuclear weapons in the first place. It's just basically we're bigger, and if you try to get them, we're going to bomb you, or worse. And I mean, strictly speaking, the United States and nobody else has any right to tell Iran that. But you have to put that aside. And then you have to say, well, why can't they at least go to 20% and produce medical isotopes for like cancer treatment? So they haven't been allowed to do that. And I think the answer is that once you get to 20%, it's easier to get from there to weapons grade uranium, which is something like 70 to 90% enrichment, whatever enrichment is, So this is already kind of you can see how it's kind of like the Serbian deal. We'll tell you things that you can't do that we have no right to really tell you, but we're just telling you or we're going to invade you. And now the new deal, as far as we can tell what it is from Trump's sporadic pronouncements, is that they can no uranium enrichment. So they can't even enrich uranium for energy. So that's one poison pill. They can't do that. I mean, they have all this oil. You have to remember, Iran is also a socialist country, more socialist than the United States, way more. So as Ron Paul was saying 15, 16 years ago, they can't even make their own gasoline because they're so incompetent. But we're supposed to be, deathly afraid of these people. And that's mainly because of their socialist economy. So they shouldn't really even need a nuclear energy program with all the oil they have. But, whatever. So they're zero uranium enrichment. So they'd have to get all of the uranium that they need for energy production from outside their country. And then number two is it's not just nukes you can't have. You have to limit your ballistic missile program. I tried to find out, well, limited how much? And I can't find a definitive statement from the administration. But basically, their ballistic missile program is their defense against Israel. So, Trump's demanding they pretty much lay down their arms and just trust Israel not to attack them. And they're never going to do that. The last time Israel did attack them, they responded with these non-nuclear missiles, and that pretty much ended the war. I mean, Trump took a victory lap saying he ended the war, but basically Iran's missile response ended that war. And then Israel agreed to a ceasefire. So, yeah, so those two, they can't agree to these. Everyone knows they can't agree to those. Everyone kind of just pretends they don't know, so we're basically saying agree to something that's impossible, or we're going to attack you. So it's almost, hey, Trump could change his mind tomorrow. All those ships, remember, they were all there his first term. He wanted maximum pressure, but he didn't want a war. And I think he's still saying that. See, when Trump bombs another country, he doesn't consider that a war. And he's not alone in that. I mean, Bill Maher, maybe I'll resurrect this. The funniest thing he ever did was this thing about how we just talk about bombing countries like it's no big deal, and this was like 15 years ago. And he said, yeah, well, we're just going to be in there. We're going to do a little light bombing, no boots on the ground. We'll be out of your hair in a week, something to that effect. It was really funny. So, this all might blow over, then all the Trump true believers will be calling us, what is it, Doomicons or panicons, whatever we are. Like, nobody should say anything about this, like on the doorstep of war with Iran. Now, one more parallel I'll draw into World War I is that, of course, there are alliances here that are troublesome. Who is Iran allied with? Well, most of the world's against them. They're allied with Russia and China. So these countries that the West is belligerent against tend to, team up together. Now, important difference, I did try to find out, and to the best of my knowledge, there's no mutual defense treaty between Russia or China and Iran. And I don't think Russia and China, neither one particularly wants to go to a war on Iran's behalf. So, Washington can probably get away with quite a bit against Iran, although, they're going to kick and scream, Russia and China will. But they do have alliances, trade alliances with Iran. And it's just one step closer to some kind of conflict with one of those two. And I keep hearing China's 5 years away from feeling like they could go to war with the United States and win. And maybe they are, maybe they're not. But they don't want to go to war with the United States. They're preparing as if they're going to be forced to go to war with the United States because, again, Washington, D.C. is the only capital that is, making threats against other countries. Now you say, well, what about Russia and Ukraine? Okay, we've done lots of podcasts on that. The short answer is Russia's never going to invade NATO countries or really go any farther in Ukraine at this point. They've conquered all the Russian-speaking territories. They made a fast play for Kiev to try to knock out the administration. And according to them, they were asked to pull back, and they did. Maybe they were fought back, whatever. Ukrainian people are no one to mess with, by the way. I think they got a much bloodier nose than they were bargaining for. But they've basically sat down in all the regions where the population speaks Russian, and they haven't tried to go beyond that very far since 2022. since they retreated from Kiev. So, besides that conflict, really, there's no other country that's like a threat to territorially. China is going around the world making deals like the United States used to do when all the European countries were squaring off against each other. And the United States is basically like, we just want to make money. And that's really been China's modus for the past 20 years. When they've increased their military spending, it's really been in reaction to all this saber rattling from Washington. So again, and I'm not trying to paint the Chinese government as this, peace-loving, free market, classical liberal, whatever. They're not, but they're not aggressive towards other countries. Okay. Same with the Russian government. You look at the map of NATO in 1995 and what it was today. And then, it was always, look, Ukraine's the last straw. They were saying that for over a decade before it happened. Okay. And NATO had troops marching around in Ukraine. It's just ridiculous to pretend that there was, the Ukraine was just minding its own business and this big country just invaded it for no reason. So, we've got plenty of other stuff on that, and I've written plenty about it. I mean, the chief aggressive capital of a major power right now is Washington, D.C. And, we, as a electorate, put Trump in there partially to dial that down, and we haven't seen much evidence of that. Okay, he hasn't started a big land war. Neither did Obama. All right, Obama did a lot of what Trump is doing. Obama went into more countries and did more color revolutions, which is basically what the U.S. did in Ukraine and what they're doing in Iran right now. And that's the other thing, the demand, you better, not oppress your protesters, which the CIA has probably hired half of them, or at least gotten into dissident groups in Iran and helped them to do this uprising. But the uprising, as far as I know, is over. So that might be off the table now. But we're sitting here with basically the Serbia situation. Either do this thing, agree to these demands that we know there's no way you can agree to, or we're coming in. And basically, the war is a fait accompli unless Trump just changes his mind because somebody talked him out of it, which is certainly possible. And let's hope that happens. Let's hope that somehow or other he ends up on a golf course with Rand Paul for a couple of days, and nobody talks to him after the golf outing, and he makes a decision to pull back on this. But we'll see. From everything we can see, some kind of military action is imminent. And I think we'll leave it there for today and leave it on that topic. I'll talk more maybe about the arrest of Prince Andrew on some confidential document, trumped up charge. They're obviously arresting him because there's no proof of his complicity in the Epstein thing. So let's find something else to arrest him about, which is basically happening all over the world. People's careers are being ruined because their name's in there. The headlines for Prince Andrew actually say, arrested because of his ties to Epstein. Translation, arrested on charges of guilt by association, because there's no evidence that he ever abused a minor. So we'll get into that on the next episode. Let's hope we're not at war by that point. And as I always say, if you haven't subscribed already, please subscribe to this podcast. Share this episode with a friend. Hey, if everybody listening shared this episode with a friend and that friend subscribed, I think by definition, we'd have twice as many listeners. So please do that for me. And I'll see you next time on Tom Mullen Talks Freedom. Thank you for listening.
The war of ideas has only just begun. Arm yourself with the knowledge you need by heading to TomMullenTalksFreedom.com and subscribing to our email list. And remember, every revolution starts in the minds of the people.